The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo through every corner of Millbrook, Minnesota, though the arrest happened quietly on a Tuesday morning when most folks were still nursing their first cups of coffee. Sheriff Tom Brennan had made the call himself. No sirens, no drama, just a gentle knock on the door of 412 Maple Street at exactly 7:43 a.m. The woman who answered wore a faded blue bathrobe and had flour on her fingers from kneading tomorrow's bread. Her name was Lily Nelson, and she had been the town's beloved baker for the past 12 years. The charges read like something from a different universe. First-degree murder in the death of Marcus Webb, dated March 15, 2011. 13 years of silence, shattered by DNA evidence that had been sitting in a Minneapolis lab waiting for technology to catch up with justice. The victim had been a traveling pharmaceutical sales rep who'd checked into the Millbrook Motor Inn and never checked out. His body was found 3 days later in Silver Lake, bloated and cold, with a single gunshot wound to the chest. Lily had been 28 then, working the night shift at the diner on Highway 7, serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs with equal measures of caffeine and kindness. She'd served Marcus Webb his last meal, a cheeseburger, medium rare, with extra pickles and a slice of apple pie that she'd baked herself. The pie had been her grandmother's recipe, a closely guarded secret that called for a dash of cardamom and a whisper of bourbon in the filling. Now, at 41, Lily stood in her kitchen surrounded by the remnants of a life carefully constructed. The bread dough sat abandoned on the marble countertop, slowly rising like hope that would never quite reach its intended height. Sheriff Brennan's voice was gentle but firm as he read her rights, each word falling like snow on the warm wooden floors of the home she'd built with her own hands. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, of Sunday morning comfort, and the kind of safety that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. "Mrs. Nelson," Sheriff Brennan said, his weathered face creased with something that might have been regret, "you have the right to remain silent." But Lily Nelson had been silent for 13 years already. The town of Millbrook had a population that hovered just above 2,000 souls, most of whom had known each other since childhood or had arrived seeking the kind of peace that only small towns can offer. It sat nestled between rolling hills covered in oak and maple, connected to the wider world by a single highway that curved through the landscape like a question mark. In winter, the town transformed into something from a postcard, all white churches and smoke rising from chimneys. In summer, the air filled with the scent of fresh-cut hay and the laughter of children playing in yards that stretched from one end of memory to the other. Lily had arrived in Millbrook in 2012, just 1 year after Marcus Webb's murder, though no one had connected those dots at the time. She'd rented a small apartment above the old pharmacy and taken the job at Murphy's Bakery, working alongside elderly Mr. Murphy until his arthritis finally convinced him to retire. When he'd offered to sell her the business, she'd accepted with tears in her eyes and a check that cleaned out her modest savings account. The bakery became the heart of her new life, a place where she could channel her restless energy into something beautiful and nourishing. She arrived each morning at 4 a.m. when the world was still dark and full of possibility. By the time the first customers arrived for their morning coffee and fresh-baked scones, the display cases would be filled with proof of her dedication. Croissants that flaked like autumn leaves, sourdough loaves with crusts that sang when tapped, and cakes decorated with such precision that ordering one for a special occasion became a kind of ritual. Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski had been one of Lily's first regular customers, a retired school teacher who stopped by every Wednesday for a cinnamon roll and a cup of coffee black enough to wake the dead. She was 73, with silver hair that she kept pinned in a neat bun and eyes sharp enough to spot a dangling participle from across a crowded room. Eleanor had taught 3rd grade for 42 years before retiring, and she had a way of seeing through people that made her both beloved and slightly feared. "That girl has secrets," Eleanor had told her neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Chen, on more than one occasion. "Not bad secrets, mind you. just the kind that make a person careful with their words and generous with their kindness. Sarah Chen owned the town's only Chinese restaurant, a small place called Golden Dragon that served surprisingly authentic dishes to a community that had learned to appreciate flavors beyond casserole and pot roast. She was 45, had moved to Millbrook with San Francisco with her teenage daughter Amy after a divorce that had left her emotionally and financially depleted. She'd found in Lily a kindred spirit, someone else who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from scattered pieces. The friendship between the three women had grown slowly, like the sourdough starter that Lily kept in a jar on her kitchen windowsill. Wednesday morning coffee became Thursday evening dinners, which became Saturday afternoon walks through the town cemetery, where they'd read the weathered headstones aloud and make up stories about the lives that had come before them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Detective Ray Martinez had been the lead investigator on the Marcus Webb case back in 2011, working out of the state police barracks in Marshall, Minnesota. At 58, he was 3 years from retirement and had seen enough murder cases to know that some secrets take time to surface. The Webb case had haunted him, not because it was particularly gruesome, but because it felt personal. Webb had been alone, far from home, killed by someone who had gotten close enough to press a gun to his chest and pull the trigger. The evidence was frustratingly sparse. Webb's rental car was found in the parking lot of the Millbrook Motor Inn, his suitcase still packed, his cell phone showing no calls after 9:30 p.m. on March 15th. The last person to see him alive was the night clerk at the motel, a nervous 22-year-old named Danny Pierce, who swore that Webb had seemed perfectly fine when he'd checked in. The murder weapon was never found, despite teams of investigators dragging Silver Lake and searching the surrounding woods. The autopsy revealed that Webb had been shot at close range with a .38 caliber pistol, the bullet passing through his heart before lodging in his spine. He would have died almost instantly, a small mercy in a case that offered few of them. For 13 years, the file had sat in Detective Martinez's desk drawer, pulled out periodically for review, but never quite forgotten. The Webb family, a sister in Portland and elderly parents in Ohio, had called regularly for the first few years, then sporadically, then not at all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A burglary in nearby Marshall, Minnesota, had resulted in the arrest of a career criminal named Bobby Hutchins, whose DNA was routinely entered into the national database. When the computer program found a partial match to evidence from the Webb murder scene, Detective Martinez felt his pulse quicken for the first time in months. The match wasn't to Bobby Hutchins himself, but to a female relative. The DNA had been found under Marcus Webb's fingernails, skin cells that had been carefully preserved and stored, waiting for science to advance enough to tell their story. A family tree analysis led investigators to 3 possible matches, and from there, the process became methodical and relentless. Lily Nelson's DNA had been collected from a coffee cup she'd discarded at Murphy's Bakery, retrieved by an undercover officer posing as a customer interested in ordering a wedding cake. The match was definitive. 99.7% probability that the skin cells under Marcus Webb's fingernails had come from her body. The warrant for her arrest had been signed by Judge Patricia Holbrook at 6:30 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, based on DNA evidence at a circumstantial case that placed Lily in the area at the time of the murder. What the warrant didn't explain, what kept Detective Martinez awake at night even after the arrest, was why. Why would a young woman with no criminal record, no apparent connection to the victim, kill a stranger in cold blood? As Sheriff Brennan's patrol car pulled away from 412 Maple Street, Lily's neighbors emerged from their homes like flowers opening to reluctant sunlight. Mrs. Henderson from next door stood in her garden, pruning shears forgotten in her gloved hands. The Yamamoto family paused their morning jog to stare at the empty driveway where Lily's Honda Civic usually sat. Children waiting for the school bus whispered questions that their parents couldn't answer. The bread dough continued to rise on Lily's kitchen counter, patient and oblivious, while outside her front door, a small crowd began to gather. Someone had already posted about the arrest on the Millbrook community Facebook page, and the comments were multiplying like cells under a microscope. Shock, disbelief, and the kind of morbid curiosity that makes tragedy temporarily entertaining. By noon, the story would be picked up by the Twin Cities media. By evening, news vans would be parked along Maple Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sun. The town of Millbrook, which had spent decades existing just below the radar of the outside world, would find itself thrust into a spotlight that revealed every crack and contradiction in its carefully maintained facade. But none of that had happened yet. In the quiet aftermath of Lily's arrest, with her abandoned bread rising toward a perfection it would never achieve, the town held its breath and waited for answers to questions it had never thought to ask. Who was Lily Nelson, really? And why had Marcus Webb died alone by a lake that reflected nothing but sky and the secrets that people carry in their hearts? The last person to see Lily before her arrest had been Amy Chen, Sarah's 23-year-old daughter, who had stopped by the bakery at 6:45 a.m. to pick up pastries for her mother's breakfast meeting with the town council. Amy worked as a freelance graphic designer, splitting her time between her mother's restaurant and a small office she'd set up in the converted garage behind their house. She'd known Lily for over a decade, had spent countless afternoons in the bakery's warm kitchen learning to braid challah and fold croissants. She seemed perfectly normal, Amy would tell Detective Martinez later that day, her voice small and confused. She asked about Mom's arthritis, gave me an extra blueberry muffin for Dad, my stepfather. She was humming something, maybe an old folk song. Her hands were steady. She looked tired, but she always looked tired in the mornings. I don't understand any of this. The register at Murphy's Bakery still held the receipt from Amy's purchase, $12.75 for an assortment of pastries and 2 cups of coffee to go. Timestamp 6:47 a.m. In 2 hours, that receipt would become evidence in a murder case that had been 13 years in the making. The question that would haunt Millbrook for months to come was simple and impossible. How well can you ever really know another person? And if Lily Nelson could keep a secret this devastating for so long, what other mysteries might be hidden behind the carefully tended facades of small-town life? Lily's daily routine had been sculpted by 13 years of careful precision, each morning carved from the darkness like hope from despair. She woke at 3:30 a.m. without an alarm, her body trained to recognize the exact moment when night began its reluctant retreat. The first few minutes were always the same. Lying still in her queen-sized bed, listening to the house settle around her and feeling the weight of another day pressing against her chest like a sleeping cat. The bedroom was sparse but comfortable, painted in shades of cream and sage green that caught the early morning light streaming through sheer curtains. A single photograph sat on her nightstand, Lily with Eleanor and Sarah at last year's county fair, all 3 women laughing at something that had been funny enough to preserve, but too fleeting to remember. There were no other personal photos, no family pictures, no evidence of a life before Millbrook, beyond the clothes in her closet and the carefully curated collection of cookbooks that lined the shelf above her reading chair. Her morning shower was always exactly 12 minutes, the water temperature set to the same degree of almost too hot that made her skin pink and her mind clear. She dressed in the same type of clothes every day, dark jeans, practical shoes, and one of a dozen identical white cotton shirts that she'd ordered online and had tailored to fit her small frame perfectly. The uniform was intentional, a way to eliminate decision-making from the morning routine and preserve her mental energy for the more complex choreography of running a bakery. By 4:15 a.m., she was in her car, a 2018 Honda Civic in unremarkable silver that she'd bought used and paid for in cash. The drive to the bakery took exactly 7 minutes, a route that wound through the sleeping town like a secret. She knew every house along the way, could identify the residents by their porch lights and the cars in their driveways. The Hendersons always left their kitchen light on. Mrs. Henderson's insomnia was legendary. The Yamamoto family had switched to LED bulbs last spring, their house now glowing with a cooler, more efficient light. Mr. Patterson's ancient pickup truck sat in the same spot it had occupied for the past 5 years, listing slightly to the left where the tire slowly lost air each night. The bakery building was over a century old, its brick exterior weathered to a warm terracotta color that looked almost golden in the early morning light. Lily had painted the trim herself when she'd bought the business, choosing a deep forest green that reminded her of Christmas trees and seemed to make the flowers in the window boxes look more vibrant. The sign above the door read Murphy's Bakery in gold lettering that was beginning to fade at the edges, though she'd never gotten around to having it repainted. Inside, the bakery was divided into 2 main areas: the customer space in front, with its display cases and small tables for people who wanted to eat their pastries while they were still warm, and the work area in back, where the real magic happened. The kitchen was Lily's sanctuary, equipped with 2 commercial ovens, a massive mixer that had been old when Mr. Murphy first bought it, and counters made of maple wood that had been scarred by thousands of hours of use, but were still beautiful in their imperfection. She always started with coffee, using beans from a roaster in Minneapolis that delivered fresh supplies every Tuesday and Friday. The first pot was for herself, strong enough to wake the dead, as Eleanor often said, with a splash of heavy cream and no sugar. The second pot was for customers, a lighter roast that wouldn't offend anyone's sensibilities but would still provide the caffeine that made morning civilization possible. While the coffee brewed, she began the day's baking. Bread came first, sourdough, whole wheat, and the honey oat loaves that were popular with young families. The sourdough starter had been her greatest triumph and her most persistent responsibility. She'd brought it with her from her previous life, a living culture that connected her to something beyond the carefully constructed present she'd built in Millbrook. The starter lived in a large glass jar on the counter, marked with measurements and feeding dates in Lily's precise handwriting. It required attention every day, fresh flour and water mixed in exact proportions, the consistency checked with the practiced eye of someone who understood that baking was as much about intuition as it was about recipes. On quiet mornings, she sometimes talked to it, whispering updates about the weather or sharing observations about customers who had become friends over the years. "Good morning, you patient thing," she would say, stirring the thick, tangy mixture with a wooden spoon that had belonged to her grandmother. "Let's make something beautiful today." The bread dough mixed and shaped, rising in the warm humidity created by the ovens, she moved on to pastries. Croissants were her specialty, a skill that took her 3 years to master and still required the kind of attention that made everything else fade into background noise. The butter had to be the perfect temperature, pliable but not soft, cold but not rigid. The dough needed to be rolled and folded with mechanical precision, creating the delicate layers that would puff and separate in the oven's heat. By 6 a.m., the bakery began to fill with the scents that would draw customers throughout the day. Cinnamon rolls glazed with cream cheese frosting, blueberry muffins studded with fruit she picked herself from bushes behind the town library, Danish pastries filled with homemade jam that she put up each summer when the local strawberries reached their peak of sweetness. The work was physically demanding, requiring her to lift 50-pound bags of flour, stand for hours at a time, and maintain the kind of focus that left her pleasantly exhausted at the end of each day. It was also deeply satisfying in ways that her previous life had never been. There was something fundamentally honest about baking. Ingredients mixed in proper proportions produced predictable results. Success could be measured by the golden color of a perfectly baked loaf, the approval of customers who returned day after day, and the simple pleasure of creating something that nourished people's bodies and spirits. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed life, Lily carried the weight of 13 years' worth of sleepless nights and carefully buried memories. She had developed a repertoire of techniques for managing the anxiety that could rise without warning, threatening to overwhelm the calm facade she'd worked so hard to maintain. When the panic came, usually in the quiet moments between customers or during the long afternoon hours when the bakery was closed, she had learned to anchor herself through physical sensations. She would press her palms flat against the cool marble counter, feeling the smooth stone against her skin. She would name 5 things she could see, 4 things she could hear, 3 things she could smell, 2 things she could touch, and 1 thing she could taste. The technique, learned from a therapist whose name she'd forgotten but whose wisdom had stayed with her, rarely failed to bring her back from the edge of the abyss. Her relationship with Eleanor Kowalski had become one of the most important anchors in her reconstructed life. The older woman had a way of asking questions without prying, of offering comfort without requiring explanation. Their Wednesday morning ritual had evolved from a simple customer transaction into something that resembled a grandmother-granddaughter relationship, though neither woman had ever explicitly acknowledged the familial quality of their bond. Eleanor would arrive at exactly 8:30 a.m., her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, wearing one of the cardigans she knitted herself during the long Minnesota winters. She always ordered the same thing, a cinnamon roll and black coffee, and always sat at the small table by the window where she could watch the town wake up around her. "You're looking tired, dear," Eleanor would say, studying Lily's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading the emotions of 8-year-olds. "Are you sleeping well?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Lily sometimes felt the dangerous urge to tell the truth. Instead, she would smile and deflect, blaming her fatigue on early mornings or a particularly challenging batch of bread. Eleanor never pushed, but her eyes suggested that she understood more than she was saying. Their conversations ranged from the practical, weather, town gossip, the ongoing drama of the city council meetings, to the philosophical. Eleanor had lived through the Great Depression as a child, had lost her husband to cancer 15 years earlier, and had raised 3 children who now lived scattered across the country. She had a perspective on life's difficulties that came from having survived them, and a way of speaking about hardship that acknowledged its reality without being consumed by it. "The thing about pain," Eleanor had said, one particularly difficult Wednesday when Lily's hands had been shaking badly enough that she'd burned a batch of scones, "is that it changes you, but it doesn't have to define you. The trick is learning to carry it gracefully, like a woman carrying a heavy purse. You know it's there, you feel its weight, but you don't let it throw off your balance." Sarah Chen had become another crucial part of Lily's support system, though their friendship was built on different foundations. Where Eleanor offered the wisdom of age and experience, Sarah provided the understanding of someone who was also rebuilding her life from broken pieces. They had bonded over their shared status as relative newcomers to Millbrook, women who had arrived carrying secrets and had found in the town's quiet rhythms a place to rest and heal. Their friendship had deepened during Sarah's divorce proceedings, when Lily had provided a steady supply of comfort food and a listening ear that asked no questions but offered unwavering support. When Sarah's daughter Amy was struggling with the transition to college, Lily had taught the girl to bake bread, giving her a skill that would serve as both practical knowledge and emotional therapy during the stressful years ahead. The 3 women, Lily, Eleanor and Sarah had formed an unlikely but powerful triangle of mutual support. They celebrated each other's successes with genuine joy and weathered each other's difficulties with the kind of loyalty usually reserved for blood family. When Eleanor's arthritis flared up, Sarah would drive her to medical appointments. When Sarah's restaurant struggled during the slow winter months, Lily would find reasons to order catering for events that may or may not have existed. When Lily's anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, both women seemed to sense her distress and would find excuses to spend time at the bakery, their presence serving as a reminder that she was not alone. But even within these precious relationships, Lily maintained careful boundaries. She never spoke about her life before Millbrook, deflecting questions about family or previous jobs with vague references to traveling around and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. When pressed, she would change the subject or find urgent tasks that required her immediate attention. She had no social media accounts, no presence on the internet beyond the basic business listing from Murphy's Bakery. She paid for everything in cash or with a debit card linked to a local bank account, avoiding the kind of credit history that could be easily traced. Her cell phone was a basic model, purchased at a big box store, used primarily for work-related calls and the occasional text message with Eleanor or Sarah. Despite these precautions, Lily had allowed herself to build a life that felt real and meaningful. She had developed genuine affection for her customers, remembering their preferences and asking about their families. She sponsored a Little League team and donated leftover pastries to the senior center. She had turned the small garden behind the bakery into a source of fresh herbs and vegetables that she used in her cooking, finding peace in the simple act of coaxing life from soil. On summer evenings, when the bakery was closed and the town had settled into the quiet rhythm of evening, she would sometimes walk through the cemetery where she'd spent so many Saturday afternoons with Eleanor and Sarah. The headstones told the story of Millbrook's history, farmers and teachers, merchants and ministers, all of them now reduced to names and dates carved in stone. She found their silence comforting, a reminder that everyone's story eventually ended, that the secrets people carried ultimately mattered less than the love they'd shared and the kindness they'd shown. But late at night, alone in her carefully arranged house, the weight of her hidden truth would sometimes become unbearable. She would lie awake replaying that March evening in 2011, wondering for the 1,000th time if there had been any other choice, any other way the story could have ended. The memory was vivid and unchanging, preserved in her mind with the clarity that trauma brings to certain moments. Marcus Webb had been charming in a way that set off every alarm bell in her nervous system. He lingered at the diner longer than most customers, ordering coffee after coffee and engaging her in conversation that felt both casual and predatory. When he'd followed her into the parking lot after her shift had ended, she'd known with absolute certainty that her carefully constructed new identity was about to be destroyed. The confrontation had been brief and terrible. Words that couldn't be taken back, threats that couldn't be ignored, and a struggle that ended with Marcus Webb bleeding out on the gravel beside his rental car. She'd driven his body to Silver Lake in a state of shock, her hands steady on the steering wheel while her mind fractured into pieces that would take years to reassemble. The gun, her grandfather's service revolver from World War II, had gone into the lake along with Webb's body. She'd driven home in the pre-dawn darkness, showered until her skin was raw, and burned the clothes she'd been wearing in the barrel behind the diner where the restaurant disposed of its kitchen waste. By the time her shift started the next evening, she was already planning her escape from the life she'd built, the identity she'd assumed, and the small Minnesota town that had briefly felt like home. But that was then, and this was now. For 13 years, she had been Lily Nelson, baker and friend, contributor to community fundraisers and reliable supplier of birthday cakes. The woman who had killed Marcus Webb felt like someone from another life, someone whose choices she understood but could no longer fully access. As she stood in her kitchen each morning, mixing dough and shaping loaves with hands that were steady and sure, she sometimes marveled at the person she had become. The terrified young woman who had fled Minnesota in 2011 could never have imagined building something as solid and beautiful as the life she had created in Millbrook. She had learned to love again, to trust, carefully but genuinely, and to find meaning in the daily act of nourishing her community. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd created her new life by returning to the same state where she'd committed the crime that had destroyed her old one.
Minnesota in 2012 had felt like the safest place to hide. Who would expect a murderer to remain so close to the scene of her crime? She'd changed her appearance, her name, and her entire way of being in the world, but she'd stayed within the borders of the state that held her deepest secret. Now, sitting in a jail cell in Marshall, Minnesota, Lily found herself thinking about the bread dough she had abandoned that morning. By now it would have overproofed, the gluten structure breaking down, the loaves destined for the garbage bin rather than the ovens. It seemed like a metaphor for something, though she was too tired to work out exactly what.
The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the tornado scare of 2018, when half the county had taken shelter in its basement while the skies churned overhead with malevolent intent. Now, 3 days after Lily Nelson's arrest, folding chairs had been arranged in hasty rows to accommodate the overflow of residents who had come seeking answers to questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Mayor Patricia Holbrook stood behind the small podium that was usually reserved for bingo night announcements and 4-H presentations, her usually perfect composure showing cracks around the edges. At 52, she'd held the mayor's office for 6 years, winning elections by comfortable margins based on her reputation for competence and her ability to keep Millbrook's municipal affairs running smoothly and without drama. The media circus that had descended on their town in the wake of Lily's arrest threatened to overwhelm the careful balance she'd worked so hard to maintain. "I want to assure everyone," Mayor Holbrook said, her voice carrying over the murmur of conversation that had been building since people began filing in an hour earlier, "that the investigation into this matter is being handled by the appropriate law enforcement agencies. The city of Millbrook is cooperating fully with Detective Martinez and the state police." The crowd's response was immediate and less than reassuring. Someone in the back shouted, "How could we not know? She was right here for 12 years!" Another voice, higher pitched with the kind of outrage that comes from feeling personally betrayed, added, "My kids ate her cookies! She made my daughter's birthday cake!" Mrs. Eleanor Kowalski sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her face a mask of composure that fooled no one who knew her well. At 73, she had weathered enough of life's storms to understand that rushing to judgment rarely led to wisdom, but the murmur of the crowd around her suggested that such patience was in short supply. Sarah Chen occupied the seat next to Eleanor, her normally serene expression clouded with confusion and something that might have been grief. Her daughter Amy sat on her other side, red-eyed from 3 days of crying and the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your understanding of the world fundamentally challenged. Amy had been closer to Lily than almost anyone in town, had spent countless hours in the bakery learning techniques that now felt tainted by association with the woman who had taught them. Detective Ray Martinez had driven up from Marshall specifically for this meeting, understanding that community relations could or break a case this high profile. At 58, he had learned that successful police work required as much psychology as detective skills, especially in small towns where everyone knew everyone and secrets had a way of spreading like wildfire through dry grass. "I understand that this news has been shocking for everyone," Detective Martinez said when Mayor Holbrook yielded the microphone to him. "Mrs. Nelson has been charged with the 2011 murder of Marcus Webb based on DNA evidence that provides a strong link between her and the victim. I want to emphasize that these are still charges. She is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law." The legal disclaimer did little to calm the crowd's agitation. Tom Morrison, who owned the hardware store next to Murphy's Bakery, raised his hand with the kind of aggressive politeness that suggested barely controlled anger. "Detective, my business shares a wall with that bakery. Are you telling me I've been working next to a murderer for over a decade? What about our safety? What about our children's safety?" Before Detective Martinez could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Tom Morrison, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." The speaker was Mrs. Dorothy Yamamoto, the 70-year-old matriarch of the family that ran the town's only gas station. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and buried a husband, who had seen enough of life to understand the truth was usually more complicated than it first appeared.
Lily Nelson has been nothing but kind to this community, Mrs. Yamamoto continued, rising slowly to her feet despite the arthritis that made standing painful. She's donated more food to charity than anyone else in town. She stayed open during the blizzard of 2019 to make sure people had bread and coffee. Before we start treating her like a monster, maybe we should remember who she's been to us for the past 12 years. The comment triggered a wave of conflicting responses that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some people nodded in agreement, remembering acts of kindness that suddenly seemed more precious in light of current circumstances. Others shook their heads with the frustrated energy of people who felt they'd been deceived, who couldn't reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the charges she now faced.
Father Michael O'Brien from St. Catherine's Catholic Church had positioned himself near the middle of the crowd, close enough to hear the various conversations that were happening in smaller clusters. At 45, he'd served the Millbrook parish for 8 years, long enough to understand the complex dynamics that governed small-town social relationships. He'd performed the blessing when Lily had bought Murphy's Bakery, had accepted dozens of donated sheet cakes for church fundraisers, and had watched her interact with parishioners with what had seemed like genuine warmth and interest. "I think," Father O'Brien said, raising his hand to request attention, "that we need to be very careful about how we respond to this situation. Whether the charges against Lily are true or false, our community's reaction will say something important about who we are as people. Are we the kind of town that abandons someone in their darkest hour, or are we the kind that seeks understanding and justice?" His words seemed to calm the atmosphere slightly, though the underlying tension remained palpable. Eleanor Kowalski took the opportunity to stand, her movements slow but determined, her presence commanding the kind of respect that comes from decades of teaching children and volunteering for every worthwhile cause in a 50-mile radius. "I've known Lily Nelson for 12 years, Eleanor said, her voice clear despite her age, carrying to every corner of the room without need for amplification. In that time, I've seen her show kindness to people who couldn't afford to buy their children birthday cakes. I've watched her work 16-hour days to make sure the high school graduation reception had enough food. I've seen her cry over injured animals and laugh at terrible jokes told by customers who needed someone to appreciate their humor." She paused, looking around the room at faces she'd known for decades, some of them former students whose scraped knees she'd bandaged and whose tears she'd dried during playground conflicts that had seemed earth-shaking at the time. "Now, I don't know what happened in 2011. I don't know what connection Lily might have had to this Marcus Webb person, but I know the woman she's been since she came to our town, and that woman deserves better than to be tried and convicted in a community center meeting based on whispers and fear." The silence that followed Eleanor's words was profound, broken only by the hum of the building's heating system and the distant sound of traffic on Highway 7. Sarah Chen wiped her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days, while Amy struggled to contain emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. But not everyone in the room was moved by Eleanor's defense. Janet Pierce, whose son Danny had been the night clerk at the Millbrook Motor Inn in 2011, stood up with the kind of righteous anger that comes from believing your family has been wronged. Danny was 33 now, married with 2 children of his own, but Janet remembered the weeks after Marcus Webb's murder when her son had been questioned repeatedly by police, his name mentioned in newspaper articles, his reputation tainted by association with a crime he hadn't committed. "That's all very nice, Eleanor," Janet said, her voice tight with emotions that had been building for 3 days. "But Marcus Webb was murdered, and now we find out the killer has been living among us, serving food to our children, acting like she was just a normal person. My son went through hell during that investigation. He couldn't sleep for months, worried that people thought he was involved.
And all that time, the real killer was right here, pretending to be our friend." The comment shifted the energy in the room again, reminding people of the human cost of the crime that had brought them all together. Marcus Webb hadn't just been a statistic in a police report. He'd been someone's son, someone's brother, a person with dreams and fears and people who loved him. His death had sent ripples through multiple communities, affecting not just his own family, but people like Danny Pierce, who had been caught in the investigation's wake. Detective Martinez recognized the moment as potentially explosive, the kind of community division that could turn a manageable investigation into a media circus that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. He stepped forward, his weathered hands raised in a gesture that requested calm without demanding silence. "Mrs. Pierce raises an important point," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Marcus Webb was a real person, with a real family who have been waiting 13 years for answers. His sister Linda still calls me every year on the anniversary of his death. His parents died without ever knowing what happened to their son. Whatever the circumstances that led to his death, we owe it to them and to our own sense of justice to let the legal system work."
He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd, seeing in them the same mixture of fear, anger, and confusion that he'd witnessed at hundreds of crime scenes over the years. Small towns weren't supposed to harbor dark secrets, but his experience had taught him that evil could flourish anywhere, often hidden behind the most ordinary facades. "What I can tell you," Detective Martinez continued, "is that Mrs. Nelson has been cooperative with our investigation. She hasn't tried to flee or resist arrest. She's agreed to speak with us without demanding a lawyer, which suggests that she understands the seriousness of the situation and wants to help us understand what happened." This information was news to most of the crowd, and it sparked a new wave of murmured conversations. Amy Chen looked up for the first time since the meeting had begun, hope flickering across her tear-stained face like sunlight through clouds. If Lily was cooperating, if she was willing to explain herself, maybe there was more to the story than the simple narrative of guilt that the media had been constructing. But hope was a dangerous commodity in a room full of people whose sense of safety had been fundamentally shaken. Bob Hendricks, who had lived across the street from Lily for 8 years and had never exchanged more than pleasantries with her, stood up with the deliberate movements of someone who had been drinking before the meeting but wasn't quite drunk enough to be removed. "Cooperative or not," Bob said, his words slightly slurred but his anger crystal clear. "She's a killer. My wife used to invite her over for Christmas dinner. We trusted her around our grandchildren. How do we know she wasn't planning to hurt someone else? How do we know we weren't all in danger?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to spread beyond anyone's ability to control. Mayor Holbrook could see the meeting deteriorating, could already imagine tomorrow's headlines about the small Minnesota town that had turned against one of its own. She stepped back to the microphone with the kind of determination that had gotten her elected in the first place. "Bob, I understand your concerns," she said, her voice projecting the calm authority that had served her well in 6 years of municipal politics. "But we need to be very careful about how we handle this situation. Lily Nelson has been charged with a crime, not convicted of one. Until and unless she's found guilty in a court of law, she remains a citizen of our community with the same rights as everyone else in this room." The mayor's words were legally correct, but emotionally unsatisfying to a crowd that wanted simple answers to complex questions. The murmur of discontent grew louder, individual conversations blending into a background hum of anxiety and frustration. Sarah Chen finally stood up,
her small frame seeming somehow larger as she faced the crowd that had known her family for over a decade. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying the kind of moral authority that comes from speaking difficult truths in difficult moments. "I've been sitting here listening to all of you talk about Lily like she's some kind of stranger who fooled us all," Sarah said, her accent carrying traces of the California childhood she'd left behind, but her words rooted firmly in the present moment. "I know who she is. I know that she worked 18-hour days to cater my daughter's graduation party, and she wouldn't take payment because she said Amy was like the daughter she'd never had." Sarah's voice broke slightly, the emotion of the past 3 days finally overwhelming her careful composure. Amy reached over to squeeze her mother's hand, offering the kind of support that flows naturally between people who have weathered storms together. "I know," Sarah continued, fighting to regain control of her voice, "that when my ex-husband came to town last year trying to cause trouble, Lily somehow knew about it before I did. She made sure I wasn't alone at the restaurant, made sure Amy had somewhere safe to go. She never asked questions, never made me explain, just provided the support I needed when I needed it." The personal testimony shifted something in the room's atmosphere, reminding people of their own experiences with Lily's kindness. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had been laid off from the grain elevator 2 summers ago, remembered the bags of day-old bread that had appeared on her doorstep every morning until he found new work. The Stevenson family recalled the birthday cake that had been delivered free of charge when their son was diagnosed with leukemia and money was too tight for celebrations. But memories of kindness couldn't erase the fundamental question that hung over the gathering like storm clouds building on the horizon. If Lily Nelson was capable of murder, if she had killed a man and hidden that truth for 13 years, what did that say about the nature of evil? How could someone who seems so fundamentally good be guilty of something so fundamentally wrong? Father O'Brien seemed to understand the theological implications of the community's struggle. He stood again, his presence commanding attention without demanding it, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to addressing difficult questions about morality and human nature. "I think," Father O'Brien said, "that we're wrestling with a question that has challenged people of faith for thousands of years. How do we reconcile our understanding of good and evil with the complex reality of human behavior? How do we love our neighbors while acknowledging that sometimes our neighbors are capable of causing great harm?" His words were met with the kind of silence that indicates deep thought rather than confusion or anger. Even people who hadn't set foot in St. Catherine's for years recognized wisdom when they heard it, understood that the priest was offering something more nuanced than the simple condemnation or unconditional support that the situation seemed to demand. "What I can tell you," Father O'Brien said, "is that our response to this crisis will define us as a community far more than the actions of any individual. We can choose to respond with fear and suspicion, turning against each other and destroying the trust that makes small-town life possible. Or we can choose to seek understanding, to support both the victim's family and the accused, and to work toward whatever version of justice and healing might be possible." Eleanor Kowalski nodded slowly, her educator's instincts recognizing the teaching moment that the priest had created. She had spent 42 years helping children navigate the complex moral landscape of growing up, learning that most situations were more complicated than they initially appeared, and that wisdom usually lay somewhere between the extremes of absolute condemnation and blind forgiveness. But teaching moments, however well-intentioned, couldn't address the practical concerns that were keeping people awake at night. Tom Morrison stood up again, his earlier anger replaced by a more fundamental worry about the implications of Lily's arrest for the town's future.
All this talk about forgiveness and understanding is fine, but what about the practical matters? What happens to the bakery? What happens to property values when the national news is calling us the town that harbored a killer? What happens to our reputation when people from the city start thinking of Millbrook as some kind of crime scene? The questions were blunt but necessary, addressing concerns that many residents had been thinking but hadn't wanted to voice. Small towns lived and died by their reputations, their ability to attract new residents and businesses, their success in maintaining the delicate balance between growth and preservation that kept communities viable. Mayor Holbrook recognized that Tom's concerns, while seeming mercenary, were actually fundamental to the town's survival. She had already fielded calls from the County Economic Development Office, the Tourism Board, and 3 different real estate agents who were worried about the long-term impact of the media attention on property values and business development. Those are legitimate concerns, the mayor acknowledged, and ones that we'll need to address in the coming weeks and months. For now, I can tell you that the City Council will be meeting an emergency session tomorrow to discuss our response to the media attention and to develop a plan for managing the situation going forward. Detective Martinez could see that the meeting was beginning to lose focus, the initial purpose of providing information to the community being overshadowed by broader concerns about the town's future. He stepped forward one more time, understanding that his next words might be the most important ones he'd spoken since arriving in Millbrook. I want to remind everyone that this investigation is ongoing. While the DNA evidence against Mrs. Nelson is strong, there are still questions that need to be answered. We don't yet understand the motive for the crime, the exact circumstances that led to Mr. Webb's death, or the full scope of what happened that night in 2011. He paused, making eye contact with as many people as possible, trying to convey the seriousness of what he was about to say. What I need from this community is patience. Let us do our jobs. Let the legal system work. And please, please be careful about what you say to the media. Anything said in anger or frustration could potentially compromise the case and prevent justice from being served.
The detective's words carried weight, but they also highlighted the impossible position the community found itself in. They were being asked to remain patient and quiet while their town was being transformed into a media spectacle, while their understanding of someone they had trusted was being completely upended, while questions about their own safety and judgment remained unanswered. As the meeting began to wind down, small groups formed throughout the room, neighbors clustering together to continue conversations that had been started but not finished. The divisions in the community were becoming clearer. Those who believed Lily deserved the benefit of the doubt until proven guilty, those who felt betrayed and wanted nothing more to do with her, and those who simply wanted the whole situation to disappear so life could return to normal. Amy Chen found herself surrounded by a small group of people closer to her own age, mostly other young adults who had grown up in Millbrook and were now trying to reconcile their childhood memories with adult realities. Jenny Peterson, who had worked part-time at the bakery during high school, was crying softly as she talked about the woman who had taught her to decorate cakes and had written her a letter of recommendation for college. "She was like a mentor to me," Jenny said, her voice thick with confusion and grief. "She taught me that baking was about more than just following recipes, that it was about putting love into everything you made. How do I reconcile that with this?" The question echoed the broader struggle that everyone in the room was facing. How do you reconcile love with betrayal, kindness with violence, the person you thought you knew with the person who might have committed an unforgivable act? Outside the community center, news vans continued their vigil, satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like mechanical prayers for better reception. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, constructing narratives from fragments of information and speculation that would be broadcast to audiences who would never understand the complex reality of small-town relationships.
The Millbrook Motor Inn, where Marcus Webb had spent his last night alive, had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts who drove hours to see the room where a murder victim had slept, the parking lot where he had walked to his death. The current owner, a man named Pete Kowalski, who was Eleanor's nephew and had bought the business 5 years earlier, found himself fielding constant calls from people wanting to book the murder room, as if tragedy were a tourist attraction. At Murphy's Bakery, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind like yellow prayer flags, keeping customers away from a business that had been the heart of the community's daily rhythm. The building sat empty and quiet, its windows dark, the sign that Lily had never gotten around to repainting now seeming prophetic in its faded condition. But perhaps the most telling scene was taking place in homes throughout Millbrook, where families gathered around dinner tables to discuss questions that had no easy answers. Children who had grown up eating Lily's cookies asked their parents how a nice lady could do something so terrible. Teenagers who had worked at the bakery wondered if they had missed signs of danger, if their judgment could be trusted in the future. Adults who had considered Lily a friend struggled with feelings of betrayal that competed with genuine concern for someone they had cared about. The ripple effects of Lily's arrest were spreading far beyond the immediate drama of criminal charges and media attention. Trust, once broken, is difficult to repair, and the revelation that someone could harbor such a significant secret for so long made everyone question what else might be hidden beneath the surface of their carefully maintained community. As the crowd finally began to disperse from the community center, people walked to their cars with the slow, careful movements of those who were no longer certain about the ground beneath their feet. The meeting had answered some questions while raising dozens of others, had provided information while creating more confusion, had attempted to bring the community together while highlighting the divisions that were beginning to form. Eleanor Kowalski, Sarah Chen, and Amy Chen walked together toward Eleanor's ancient Buick, their footsteps echoing in the parking lot that was slowly emptying of cars and people. The three women who had been closest to Lily now found themselves bound together by shared grief and confusion, united in their determination to seek truth while supporting each other through whatever revelations might be coming.
"What do you think happens now?" Amy asked, her voice small in the darkness that had settled over the town like a blanket. Eleanor considered the question carefully, drawing on 7 decades of experience with human nature and small-town dynamics. "I think," she said finally, "that we're about to learn who we really are as a community, and I think that might be more important than whatever we learn about Lily." The truth began to emerge not in the dramatic courtroom revelation that television shows had trained people to expect, but in the quiet, fluorescent-lit interview room at the Marshall County Sheriff's Department, where Lily Nelson sat across from Detective Ray Martinez and told a story that would reshape everything the people of Millbrook thought they knew about justice, survival, and the complicated nature of human morality. Detective Martinez had conducted thousands of interviews over his 30-year career, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was lying, hiding information, or preparing to confess to crimes that had haunted them for years. But Lily Nelson presented a puzzle that challenged his experience. She sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, her eyes clear and focused in ways that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for 13 years. "I need you to understand," Lily said, her voice carrying across the small room with surprising strength, "that Marcus Webb wasn't some random victim. He was my half-brother, and he came to Minnesota to destroy the life I had built after escaping a situation that almost killed me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for over a decade. Detective Martinez felt his understanding of the case shift fundamentally, the simple narrative of random violence giving way to something far more complex and troubling. "Tell me about your relationship with Marcus," Detective Martinez said, his voice carefully neutral despite the racing of his pulse. "Start from the beginning." Lily took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of strength that had been carefully maintained through 13 years of silence. My real name is Sarah Elizabeth Webb. I was born in Duluth in 1982 to a mother who struggled with addiction and a father who disappeared when I was 3. When I was 8, my mother married Marcus's father, David Webb, and we moved to his house in Superior, Wisconsin. The revelation that the victim and the accused were siblings sent shockwaves into the investigation that would reverberate through the Millbrook community for months to come. Detective Martinez had seen cases of domestic violence escalate to murder, had investigated family disputes that ended in tragedy, but the 13-year gap between the crime and its resolution added layers of complexity that made his head spin. David Webb was abusive, Lily continued, her voice remaining steady despite the emotional weight of what she was describing. Not physically at first, but psychologically. He controlled every aspect of our lives, what we ate, where we went, who we talked to. Marcus was his biological son, 6 years older than me, and he learned early that the way to survive in that house was to ally himself with his father's authority. She paused, looking out the small window that provided the only natural light the interview room had, as if gathering strength from the gray Minnesota sky that stretched toward horizons she had been running toward for most of her adult life. When I turned 14, the abuse became sexual, Lily said, the words delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had spent years in therapy learning to speak about trauma without being destroyed by it. David would wait until my mother was working her night shift at the hospital, and Marcus would serve as a lookout, making sure I couldn't escape or call for help. Detective Martinez felt his stomach clench with the familiar rage that came with hearing about crimes against children, the kind of evil that made his job both necessary and emotionally devastating. He had worked dozens of child abuse cases over the years, had seen the long-term damage that such trauma inflicted on its victims, had learned to recognize the particular kind of strength that survivors developed as they fought to rebuild their lives.
The interview room seemed to grow smaller as Lily's story unfolded, the weight of decades-old trauma filling the space between detective and suspect in ways that challenged every assumption about the case. Detective Martinez had been expecting a confession to murder. Instead, he was hearing testimony about crimes that should have been prosecuted years earlier, but had been hidden by the silence that shame and fear impose on their victims. When I turned 18, I reported the abuse to the local police, Lily said, but David Webb was a respected member of the community, a deacon at his church, a man who had never had so much as a traffic ticket. The investigation was half-hearted at best, and when it became clear that nothing was going to happen, David and Marcus made it very clear that if I continued to cause trouble, I would disappear permanently. She pulled a manila folder from the bag she had brought to the interview, extracting photographs and documents that she had carried with her for 13 years, like evidence of a life that most people would have tried to forget. The photos showed a young woman with bruises on her arms and face, medical records documenting injuries that had been explained away as accidents, police reports that had been filed and apparently forgotten. I ran away in 2000, Lily continued, and spent the next 11 years building a new identity, moving from state to state, working jobs that paid cash, trying to stay invisible. I became Sarah Miller, then Jennifer Walsh, then finally Lily Nelson when I thought I had found a place where I could be safe. Detective Martinez examined the documents she had provided, seeing in them the careful planning of someone who understood that survival sometimes requires the complete abandonment of your previous identity. The fake driver's licenses and social security cards were well made, but not perfect, the kind of documentation that would pass casual inspection, but might not survive serious scrutiny. In 2010, I got a job at the roadside diner outside Marshall, Lily said. I was working nights, saving money, thinking about maybe settling down for real. I had been Lily Nelson for almost 2 years, And it was starting to feel like more than just another identity. It was starting to feel like who I really was. The transformation from victim to survivor to someone capable of building a meaningful life was evident in her voice, in the way her posture straightened as she talked about the person she had become during those brief months of safety and hope. Then Marcus showed up, Lily said. And for the first time since the interview began, her composure cracked slightly. He'd been looking for me for years, hiring private investigators, following paper trails, using resources that I didn't have access to. He found me through a credit check I had run when I was thinking about renting a better apartment. Detective Martinez could imagine the terror that must have accompanied the realization that the past had finally caught up with her, that the safety she had worked so hard to build was about to be destroyed by someone who had already stolen so much of her life. He didn't approach me at work. He was too smart for that. Instead, he checked in to the Millbrook Motor Inn and started coming to the diner during my shifts, ordering coffee and watching me, letting me know that he had found me without saying a word about our history. The psychological torture of being stalked by someone who knew your deepest secrets, who had been complicit in your abuse, who could destroy your carefully constructed new life with a single phone call, was evident in the way Lily's hands trembled slightly as she described those final days before the confrontation that would end in Marcus Webb's death. On March 15th, he finally approached me. It was near the end of my shift, around 2 a.m., and there were no other customers in the diner. He sat in the corner booth and waited until I had to bring him his check. That's when he told me what he wanted. Detective Martinez leaned forward, understanding that they were approaching the moment that had defined the past 13 years of both Lily's life and his own investigation. What did he want? Money first. He wanted $50,000, which was more than I had made in the previous 5 years combined. But more than that, he wanted control. He wanted me to come back to Wisconsin, to resume the relationship we had when I was a teenager, to be available to him whenever he decided he needed me.
The demand was so fundamentally evil that Detective Martinez felt his professional objectivity wavering. He had spent his career trying to understand the motivations behind the worst human behavior, but there was something particularly sickening about using childhood trauma as leverage for continued abuse. He said that if I refused, he would expose my false identity to the police, Lily continued. He would tell everyone in the diner, everyone in town, exactly who I really was and what I had accused his father of doing. He said he would make sure that I spent the rest of my life running, that no matter where I went or what name I used, he would find me again. The threat was comprehensive and credible, designed to exploit every vulnerability that Marcus had helped create during their shared childhood. Detective Martinez could see how someone in Lily's position might feel that violence was the only option left, the only way to end a cycle of abuse that had already stolen 2 decades of her life. I told him I needed time to think, Lily said. I got off work at 3 a.m. and walked to my car, hoping that maybe I could just drive away again, start over somewhere else. But he was waiting for me in the parking lot. The confrontation that followed had been brief but decisive. Marcus Webb, emboldened by years of getting away with abuse and confident in his ability to control his half-sister through fear and intimidation, had underestimated the woman that Lily Nelson had become during her years of hiding and healing. He grabbed my arm, Lily said, touching the spot where bruises had faded more than a decade earlier, but where the memory of pain remained vivid. He said that thinking time was over, that we were going to resolve this right now. He had a hotel room, he said, and we were going to go there and work out the details of our new arrangement. The euphemism was transparent and nauseating. Detective Martinez had heard enough testimony from abuse survivors to understand what Marcus Webb had been planning.
the continuation of a pattern of sexual violence that had begun when his victim was barely 14 years old. I had been carrying my grandfather's gun in my purse for 3 years. It was a .38 revolver that he had carried in World War II, the only thing of value that my mother had managed to keep when we moved in with David Webb. I had never fired it, barely knew how to use it, but it made me feel safer to have it. The revelation that the murder weapon had been a family heirloom, carried as protection rather than with premeditated intent to kill, added another layer of complexity to a case that was already challenging every assumption about guilt, innocence, and justice. When Marcus grabbed me, when he started forcing me toward his car, something inside me just broke, Lily said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I had spent 17 years being afraid of him, 11 years running from him, and in that moment I realized that I was done being afraid. The struggle had been brief but violent. Marcus Webb, surprised by his half-sister's resistance and unprepared for the possibility that his victim might fight back, had been shot once in the chest at close range. He had died within minutes, his blood mixing with the gravel of the diner's parking lot while Lily stood over him in shock, trying to understand what she had just done. I knew I had to move the body. I couldn't leave him there for someone else to find, couldn't risk the investigation that would follow. I used his rental car to drive him to Silver Lake, thinking that the water would hide the evidence long enough for me to disappear again. The decision to dispose of the body rather than call the police spoke to the depth of Lily's distrust in the justice system, a skepticism that had been earned through years of being failed by institutions that were supposed to protect her. I threw the gun in the lake along with his body. Then I drove the rental car back to the motel and wiped down everything I had touched. I went home, showered, burned my clothes, and started planning my next disappearance. But instead of running again, Lily had made a decision that would define the next 13 years of her life. Millbrook, Minnesota had felt different from all the other places she had hidden. The people were genuinely kind, the pace of life was manageable, and for the first time since childhood, she had begun to imagine a future that involved something more than mere survival.
I decided to stay, Lily said. I know it sounds crazy, but something about this place made me feel like I could build a real life here. I got the job at Murphy's Bakery, started making friends, began to believe that maybe I could be more than just a victim running from her past. The transformation from Sarah Elizabeth Webb to Lily Nelson represented more than just a change of identity. It was a conscious decision to choose hope over fear, community over isolation, healing over the kind of perpetual vigilance that had defined her previous decade of running. For 13 years, I've been waiting for this day, Lily said, looking directly at Detective Martinez for the first time since her confession had begun. I've known that eventually the truth would come out, that I would have to face the consequences of what I did. But I also knew that I needed those years to become the person I was meant to be, to build relationships that mattered, to contribute something positive to the world. Detective Martinez sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything he had heard settling over him like snow on a winter landscape. The case that had seemed so straightforward, DNA evidence linking a suspect to a victim, had revealed itself to be something far more complex, a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice, self-defense, and the long-term consequences of childhood trauma. Lily, he said, using her chosen name rather than her legal one, I need you to understand that what you've told me doesn't make the killing legal. You'll still face charges, still need to stand trial, still need to let a jury decide whether your actions were justified. She nodded, her composure returning as she prepared for the next phase of a journey that had been inevitable since that March night in 2011. I understand. I've had 13 years to prepare for this. I know that there are consequences, and I'm ready to face them. The interview concluded with paperwork and procedures, but the real work of understanding what had happened was just beginning.
Detective Martinez knew that Lily's testimony would need to be corroborated, that the investigation would have to expand to include the abuse allegations that had motivated the killing, that the case was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Within hours of Lily's confession, the story began to leak to the media through sources that Detective Martinez couldn't identify but suspected were connected to the prosecutor's office. The revelation that the Millbrook baker had killed her abusive half-brother in what she claimed was self-defense transformed the narrative from a simple murder case to a complex story about trauma, survival, and the inadequacy of systems designed to protect vulnerable people. The reaction in Millbrook was immediate and divided. Eleanor Kowalski, reached by phone at her home, told a reporter from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that the revelation explains everything and nothing at the same time. Sarah Ken closed her restaurant for 3 days, unable to process the information while maintaining the composure necessary to serve customers. Amy Ken locked herself in her room and refused to speak to anyone, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions that Lily's story had triggered. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Linda Webb, Marcus's sister, who lived in Portland, Oregon, released a statement through her attorney that would further complicate the community's understanding of the case. "My family has known for years that Marcus was capable of violence. We have suspected for decades that he and our father were involved in the abuse of family members, but we were never able to prove it or stop it. While we grieve Marcus's death, we also recognize that his actions may have left someone with no choice but to defend themselves." The statement from Marcus Webb's own sister provided a level of corroboration for Lily's claims that even Detective Martinez hadn't expected. It suggested that the abuse she had described wasn't the fantasy of someone trying to justify murder, but a pattern of behavior that had been known to other family members who had felt powerless to intervene. As news of Lily's confession and the family's response spread through Millbrook, the community found itself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. If Lily had indeed killed Marcus Webb,
had been defending herself against a predator who had already stolen decades of her life, was she a hero or a criminal? If the system had failed to protect her as a child and teenager, did she have the right to protect herself as an adult, even if that protection involved taking a life? The questions were particularly difficult for people who had known and loved Lily for over a decade, who had benefited from her kindness and generosity, who had never suspected that the woman kneading bread in Murphy's Bakery was carrying such a devastating secret. The revelation forced them to confront uncomfortable truth about the nature of trauma, the inadequacy of legal protections for abuse victims, and the possibility that sometimes good people are forced to do terrible things in order to survive. Father O'Brien found himself fielding calls from parishioners who wanted theological guidance on questions that had challenged moral philosophers for centuries. Eleanor Kowalski spent sleepless nights reconsidering every conversation she'd ever had with Lily, looking for signs she had missed or clues she had failed to understand. Sarah Chen struggled with feelings of guilt about not recognizing her friend's pain, even though that pain had been hidden with the skill that comes from years of practice at concealing trauma. The transformation in community opinion was gradual but unmistakable. Where there had been shock and betrayal, there was now a growing sense of protectiveness towards someone who had survived horrors that most people couldn't imagine. Where there had been fear about having a killer in their midst, there was now understanding that they had been harboring a survivor who had been forced to make an impossible choice. But understanding and forgiveness weren't universal. Some residents remained convinced that murder was murder, regardless of the circumstances that had led to it. Others worried about the precedent that might be set if people were allowed to take justice into their own hands, even when the legal system had failed them. The division in the community reflected broader societal debates about domestic violence, self-defense, and the rights of abuse survivors. Lily's case became a flashpoint for discussions about topics that many people preferred not to think about, forcing uncomfortable conversations about the prevalence of sexual abuse and the inadequacy of legal protections for its victims. As the weeks passed and more details of Lily's story became public, support for her began to organize. A legal defense fund was established by a coalition of domestic violence organizations and victims' rights groups. Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse in Marshall, Minnesota, carrying signs that read, "Survivors have the right to survive," and "Justice for Lily." But perhaps the most meaningful support came from her adopted community of Millbrook, where people who had known her as a friend and neighbor began to speak out about the woman they had come to love. Letters to the editor in the local newspaper described acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed by the media, small gestures of compassion that revealed the character of someone who had chosen to respond to her own trauma by making the world a little bit better for other people. The complexity of the case was reflected in the charges that were ultimately filed. The prosecutor, under intense public scrutiny and facing pressure from both sides of the political spectrum, decided to charge Lily with second-degree manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, acknowledging that the circumstances of the killing didn't fit the pattern of premeditated murder, but still required legal consequences. The decision satisfied no one completely, but reflected the complexity of a case that challenged simple categories of guilt and innocence. For Lily, facing the possibility of decades in prison, the reduced charges represented a small victory in a legal battle that would determine the rest of her life. For the people of Millbrook, it was another reminder that justice was more complicated than they had ever imagined. The trial of Lily Nelson began on a crisp October morning 6 months after her arrest in a courthouse in Marshall, Minnesota that had been transformed by media attention into something resembling a fortress. Security guards checked every person entering the building, metal detectors hummed constantly, and satellite trucks lined the surrounding streets like mechanical sentinels, documenting every moment of the proceedings. Judge Patricia Holbrook, no relation to Millbrook's mayor despite the shared surname, presided over the case with the careful precision of someone who understood that the eyes of the nation were watching. At 62, she'd handled thousands of criminal cases during her 20-year tenure on the bench, but few had attracted the level of public attention or carried the social implications of the case against Lily Nelson.
The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves, built their case around the fundamental principle that taking another person's life, regardless of the circumstances, required legal consequences. Reeves was 45, a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on securing convictions in difficult cases, but he approached the Nelson case with obvious reluctance, understanding that public opinion was largely sympathetic to the defendant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reeves said during his opening statement, "we are not here to relitigate the tragedy of childhood abuse or to debate the failures of the social service system. We are here to determine whether the defendant, Lily Nelson, committed the crime of manslaughter when she shot and killed Marcus Webb on March 15, 2011. The law is clear. Taking another person's life requires justification that meets specific legal standards, and we will demonstrate that those standards were not met in this case." The defense team, led by renowned victims' rights attorney Margaret Sullivan, had flown in from Minneapolis specifically to handle Lily's case. Sullivan was 58, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from 30 years of defending people who had been failed by every other system designed to protect them. She had taken the case pro bono, understanding that it represented far more than the fate of a single defendant. "What happened in that parking lot 13 years ago," Sullivan said in her opening statement, "was not murder. It was the final act of self-defense by a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to escape from a predator who refused to let her go. The prosecution wants you to ignore the context of this case,
to pretend that Marcus Webb was an innocent victim rather than a man who had spent decades terrorizing his half-sister and who came to Minnesota with the explicit intention of resuming that terrorization. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of the abuse that had shaped Lily's entire life. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a forensic psychologist who specialized in trauma cases, testified about the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse and the ways that victims often develop hypervigilance and defensive behaviors that can persist for decades. Miss Nelson exhibits all the classic symptoms of someone who has survived prolonged childhood trauma, Dr. Morrison explained to the jury. Her decision to carry a weapon, her carefully constructed new identity, her hypervigilance about her surroundings, these are not the behaviors of someone planning to commit murder. They are the survival mechanisms of someone who has learned through terrible experience that the world can be a dangerous place. The testimony from Linda Webb, Marcus's sister, provided crucial corroboration for Lily's claims about the abuse she had suffered. Appearing via video link from Portland, Linda described a family dynamic that had been poisoned by her father's controlling behavior and her brother's willingness to participate in and enable that control. Marcus learned early that he could gain our father's approval by helping to control the women in our household, Linda testified, her voice breaking as she spoke about family secrets that had been hidden for decades. I was older, away at college during the worst of it, but I knew what was happening. I tried to get Sarah, that's what we called her then, I tried to get her to come live with me, but she was too afraid. They had convinced her that no one would believe her, that she had nowhere to go. The prosecution's case was hampered by the absence of the murder weapon and the 13-year gap between the crime and its prosecution. Witnesses had died or disappeared, physical evidence had been compromised, and the original investigation had focused on finding a random killer rather than exploring the complicated family dynamics that had motivated the crime. Detective Martinez testified about Lily's cooperation with the investigation and her willingness to provide information that could only have come from someone who had been present during Marcus Webb's final moments. In my 30 years of police work, I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who is lying and someone who is telling a painful truth. Miss Nelson's account of what happened that night has the ring of authenticity, including details that she couldn't have known unless she was there. The most powerful testimony came from Lily herself, who spent 2 days on the witness stand describing a lifetime of abuse and the decision to fight back that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She spoke without notes, her voice steady and clear, making eye contact with jurors as she described experiences that most people couldn't imagine surviving. I want you to understand, Lily said during cross-examination, that I never wanted to hurt anyone. I spent 11 years running from my past, trying to build a life where I could feel safe, where I could contribute something positive to the world. When Marcus found me, when he made it clear that he intended to resume the abuse that had defined my childhood, I felt like I was backed into a corner with no way out.
The prosecutor pressed her about her decision to dispose of the body rather than call the police, suggesting that this demonstrated consciousness of guilt rather than the desperate actions of someone acting in self-defense. Mr. Reeves, Lily responded, when you've spent your entire life being failed by the systems that are supposed to protect you, when you've been told by police officers that your word isn't credible, when you've watched abusers walk free because they're respected members of the community, you learn not to trust those systems to deliver justice. I was terrified that no one would believe me, that I would spend the rest of my life in prison for defending myself against someone who had already stolen so much of my life. The testimony from Millbrook residents provided a counterpoint to the prosecution's portrayal of Lily as someone capable of cold-blooded murder. Eleanor Kowalski, now 74 but still sharp as a tack, described the woman she had known for over a decade, someone who had shown nothing but kindness to everyone she encountered, who had contributed immeasurably to the life of their small community. Lily Nelson is not a killer, Eleanor told the jury, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 42 years reading people's character. She is a survivor who was forced to make an impossible choice. The woman who taught my neighbor's daughter to bake bread, who stayed open during blizzards to make sure people had food, who donated more to charity than anyone else in town. That woman doesn't deserve to be punished for protecting herself from someone who meant to do her harm. Sarah Chen's testimony was particularly emotional, describing the friendship that had sustained both women through difficult times and the revelation that had forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about trauma and survival. "When I learned the truth about Lily's past," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, "I didn't feel betrayed. I felt ashamed that she had carried such a burden alone for so long, that she hadn't felt safe enough to share her pain with people who loved her. If anything, knowing what she survived makes me respect her more, not less." The trial's most dramatic moment came when the defense played audio recordings that had been made during the original 2000 police investigation into Lily's abuse allegations. The recordings, which had been stored in a Wisconsin evidence locker and forgotten until Margaret Sullivan's investigators tracked them down, featured a young woman's voice describing in heartbreaking detail the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her stepfather and stepbrother. "Please," the voice on the recording pleaded, "you have to help me. I can't go back there. If you don't believe me, if you don't stop them, they're going to kill me." The voice was clearly recognizable as a younger version of Lily, speaking with the desperation of someone who understood that she was running out of options. The officer's response on the recording was devastating in its dismissiveness. "Look, honey, these are serious accusations you're making. You'd better be real sure about this, because if you're lying, you could face charges yourself. And David Webb is a respected man in this community. People aren't going to take kindly to you trying to destroy his reputation with stories that can't be proven." The jury listened to the recording in complete silence, several members visibly emotional as they heard first-hand evidence of the systemic failure that had forced a teenage girl to take justice into her own hands years later. The prosecution objected to the admission of the recordings, arguing that they were prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific charges against Lily, but Judge Holbrook ruled that they provided crucial context for understanding the defendant's state of mind during the events of March 15, 2011. As the trial progressed, public support for Lily continued to grow. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day, holding signs that read, "Survivors deserve justice," and "Lily is a hero, not a criminal." A social media campaign with the hashtag #StandWithLily gained hundreds of thousands of followers, sharing stories from other abuse survivors who saw their own experiences reflected in Lily's case. The support wasn't universal. Some victims' rights groups argued that vigilante justice, no matter how understandable the motivation, couldn't be tolerated in a civilized society. Religious leaders debated the morality of taking a life, even in self-defense. Legal scholars worried about the precedent that might be set if juries were allowed to excuse murder based on the victim's past behavior. But the overwhelming response from the public was one of sympathy and support for a woman who had survived horrors that most people couldn't imagine, and who had built a life of service and kindness despite, or perhaps because of, her traumatic past.
The closing arguments encapsulated the fundamental disagreement about how society should respond to cases where survivors of abuse are forced to defend themselves against their abusers. Prosecutor Reeves argued that the law couldn't bend to accommodate individual circumstances, no matter how sympathetic. "If we excuse this killing," Reeves told the jury, "we're saying that people can take the law into their own hands whenever they feel threatened, that the justice system can be bypassed whenever someone believes they won't be believed or protected. That's not justice, that's anarchy." Defense attorney Sullivan countered that true justice required understanding the full context of Lily's actions, including the lifetime of abuse that had preceded them, and the failure of every system that should have protected her. "Lily Nelson didn't choose to be a victim," Sullivan said in her closing argument. "She didn't choose to be abused as a child, abandoned by the justice system as a teenager, or stalked by her abuser as an adult. The only choice she made was to survive, to defend herself when no one else would defend her, and to build a life that honored the values of kindness and service that her abusers had tried to destroy." The jury deliberated for 18 hours over 3 days, their extended discussions reflecting the complexity of the case and the difficulty of the decision they had been asked to make. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable, with supporters and opponents of Lily filling every available seat. The verdict was not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears as Lily collapsed into her attorney's arms, overwhelmed by relief and the realization that she was finally free from the legal consequences of a decision that had haunted her for 13 years. Judge Holbrook banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while tears streamed down her own cheeks. Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued, as hundreds of supporters gathered to cheer Lily's emergence from the building where her fate had been decided. She spoke briefly to the crowd, her voice strong despite the emotional weight of the moment. "This verdict isn't just about me," Lily said, standing behind a podium that had been hastily erected on the courthouse steps. "This is about every survivor who has been told that their pain doesn't matter, that their truth won't be believed, that they have no right to defend themselves. Today, a jury of 12 people said that survivors deserve justice, and that sometimes justice means understanding that good people can be forced to make terrible choices." The impact of the verdict extended far beyond the courthouse steps. Domestic violence organizations across the country hailed it as a landmark decision that recognized the rights of abuse survivors to defend themselves when all other protections had failed. Legal scholars debated its implications for future cases involving survivors who fought back against their abusers. But perhaps the most significant impact was felt in Millbrook, where Lily's vindication was celebrated as a victory for their entire community. The trial had forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse, survival, and the complexity of human nature. But it had also revealed the strength of the bonds that connected them to each other and to the woman who had found healing in their midst. 3 months after her acquittal, Lily returned to Millbrook to a hero's welcome. Murphy's Bakery, which had sat empty during her incarceration and trial, was cleaned and restocked by volunteers who had kept the business ready for her return. A banner reading "Welcome Home, Lily" stretched across Main Street, and half the town turned out to watch her unlock the door of the building that had been her sanctuary for over a decade. The first customer through the door was Eleanor Kowalski, carrying flowers and wearing one of her hand-knitted cardigans, her face wreathed in the kind of smile that comes from seeing justice finally served. "The usual?" Lily asked, her voice catching with emotion as she looked at the friend who had stood by her through the darkest period of her life.
"The usual," Eleanor confirmed, settling into her customary seat by the window. "And take your time, dear. We have all day." 5 years later, on a warm September morning in 2029, Murphy's Bakery hummed with the familiar rhythms that had defined Lily Nelson's life for nearly 2 decades. The sun streamed through windows that she had cleaned herself the evening before, casting golden light across display cases filled with the same artisanal breads and pastries that had made her bakery the heart of Millbrook's community life. But changes were evident everywhere, subtle transformations that spoke to the evolution of both Lily and the town that had become her home. The walls now displayed framed photographs documenting the bakery's history, Lily with various customers over the years, community events that had been catered from her kitchen, and a prominent picture of the day she had returned from her trial to find the entire town waiting to welcome her home. A new addition to the bakery was the Survivor's Corner, a small section near the back where comfortable chairs surrounded a table laden with books about trauma recovery, domestic violence resources, and contact information for counseling services. It had been Lily's idea, implemented after dozens of abuse survivors had reached out to her following the trial, seeking guidance from someone who had not only survived, but thrived. Eleanor Kowalski, now 79 but still sharp as ever, maintained her Wednesday morning ritual with the dedication of someone for whom routine had become a form of prayer. Her arthritis had progressed to the point where she needed a walker to get around, but she still arrived at exactly 8:30 a.m., still ordered the same cinnamon roll and black coffee, and still provided the kind of steady wisdom that comes from having witnessed 8 decades of human folly and resilience. "You know," Eleanor said on this particular morning, watching Lily arrange fresh scones in the display case with the same careful precision she had employed for years, "I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind when we're gone." Lily looked up from her work, recognizing the thoughtful tone that usually preceded one of Eleanor's more philosophical observations. At 47, Lily had developed lines around her eyes and gray threads in her dark hair, but her movements remained fluid and purposeful, her hands steady as they shaped dough and arranged pastries. "What brought that on?" Lily asked, pouring Eleanor's coffee with the ritual precision of someone who had performed this same action thousands of times. "Oh, just reading about some of the young women who have reached out to you over the years. Girls who found the courage to leave abusive situations because they heard your story. Women who decided to press charges because they saw that someone would believe them. You've built something remarkable here, dear. Not just a business, but a kind of healing." The observation was more accurate than Eleanor might have realized. In the 5 years since her trial, Lily had become an unofficial advocate for abuse survivors, using her platform to speak at conferences, support legislative changes, and provide resources for people trying to rebuild their lives after trauma. The bakery had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, with survivors traveling from across the country to meet the woman who had fought back and won. Sarah Chen had evolved her own role in the community's healing process, transforming the Golden Dragon restaurant into a gathering place for difficult conversations about domestic violence, trauma, and community responsibility. Her daughter Amy, now 28 and married to a teacher from the high school, had become a professional counselor specializing in trauma recovery, inspired by watching her mother's friend navigate the complexities of survival and justice. The changes in Millbrook extended far beyond the businesses on Main Street. The trial had forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the prevalence of abuse and the inadequacy of existing support systems, leading to the establishment of a domestic violence resource center housed in the renovated basement of the community center. The center was staffed by volunteers who had been trained to recognize signs of abuse and to provide support for people trying to escape dangerous situations. Mayor Patricia Holbrook, now serving her 4th term, had made addressing domestic violence a cornerstone of her administration. The city had implemented new policies requiring municipal employees to undergo training on recognizing and responding to abuse, had partnered with neighboring communities to establish a regional safe house, and had created a fund to provide emergency assistance for people trying to leave abusive relationships.
Detective Ray Martinez had retired 3 years earlier, but not before using Lily's case to advocate for changes in how law enforcement agencies handled historical abuse allegations. He had testified before the state legislature about the importance of taking survivors' reports seriously, even when the allegations involved respected community members, and it helped develop new protocols for investigating cold cases that might involve domestic violence. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Lily said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor with her own cup of coffee. "I think about Marcus, about what his life might have been like if someone had intervened when he was young. If someone had recognized that children who participate in abuse are often victims themselves." It was a complexity that Lily had struggled with for years, the recognition that her half-brother, despite the terrible things he had done, had also been shaped by the same toxic family dynamics that had traumatized her. Therapy had helped her understand that acknowledging his victimization didn't excuse his choices, but it had also helped her find a kind of peace with the decisions she had been forced to make. "Forgiveness," Eleanor said, recognizing the direction of Lily's thoughts, "doesn't always mean excusing someone's behavior. Sometimes it means understanding that hurt people often hurt other people, and that breaking cycles of abuse requires both justice and compassion." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the morning's first customer, a young woman in her early 20s who approached the counter with the hesitant movements of someone who wasn't entirely sure she belonged. Lily recognized the body language immediately, the hypervigilance, the careful positioning near the exit, the way of holding herself that suggested she was ready to run at the first sign of danger. "Good morning," Lily said, her voice warm but not overwhelming, giving the young woman space to respond at her own pace. "Can I help you find something?" "I heard about this place, about you. I drove here from Iowa. I don't really know why." Lily's heart ached with recognition.
She had seen dozens of women just like this one over the past 5 years. Survivors seeking something they couldn't quite name, drawn to a place where someone else had faced the worst and found a way to build something beautiful from the wreckage. "Would you like some coffee?" Lily asked. "It's on the house. And if you want to talk, I have time. If you don't want to talk, that's okay too. Sometimes just being in a safe place is enough." The young woman's eyes filled with tears at the offer of simple kindness without strings attached. She nodded, accepting the coffee and settling into one of the comfortable chairs in the survivor's corner, where she could see the door but didn't have to worry about being approached by other customers. Interactions like this had become a regular part of Lily's life, though she had never advertised herself as a counselor or formally promoted the bakery as a resource for abuse survivors. Word had spread through networks of advocates and support groups, creating a kind of underground railroad that led to the small Minnesota town where someone had proved that it was possible to survive the worst and build something meaningful from the wreckage. The legal and social changes that had followed Lily's trial continued to reverberate through the justice system. Several states had modified their self-defense laws to better protect abuse survivors who fought back against their attackers. The Lily Nelson Standard, as legal scholars had dubbed it, required courts to consider the full context of domestic violence cases, including historical patterns of abuse and the failure of other systems to provide protection. Not all the changes had been positive. Lily had received death threats from people who believed that her acquittal set a dangerous precedent, who worried that recognizing the rights of abuse survivors to defend themselves would lead to increased vigilante violence. She had been forced to install security cameras around her home and bakery, and had learned to vary her routines in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of the years she had spent running from her past. But the positive responses far outweighed the negative ones. Letters arrived daily from survivors who credited Lily's story with giving them the courage to leave abusive
relationships, to press charges against their attackers, or simply to believe that their lives could be more than just an endless cycle of victimization. A scholarship fund established in her name provided resources for abuse survivors who wanted to pursue education or start businesses, helping them build the economic independence that was often crucial for escaping dangerous situations. The most profound change, however, was in Lily herself. The woman who had spent decades carrying the weight of secrets and shame had been transformed by the experience of speaking her truth and being believed. The hypervigilance that had once defined her daily existence had softened into a more manageable awareness, allowing her to form deeper relationships and take risks that would have been unthinkable during her years of hiding. She had started dating for the first time since her early 20s, tentatively exploring a relationship with David Richardson, a social worker from Marshall, who specialized in helping trauma survivors. Their courtship was slow and careful, built on honest conversations about past wounds and present healing, but it represented a kind of hope that Lily had never allowed herself to feel. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she had confessed to Eleanor during one of their Wednesday morning conversations, "for something to happen that proves I don't deserve happiness, that the peace I found here isn't real." Eleanor had considered the comment carefully, drawing on 7 decades of experience with the complexities of human emotion. "Healing isn't a destination, dear," she had finally said. "It's a process. And part of that process is learning to trust that you deserve good things, that the abuse you suffered doesn't define your worth or limit your possibilities." The conversation had taken place 2 years earlier, but Lily still thought about it regularly, especially during moments when contentment threatened to overwhelm her with its unfamiliarity. Learning to accept happiness, she had discovered, required a different kind of courage than learning to survive trauma. 3 years later, the bakery had expanded to include a small cafe area where people could linger over their coffee and pastries, creating the kind of community gathering space that small towns needed but often struggled to maintain. The expansion had been funded partly through Lily's own savings and partly through donations from supporters who had followed her story and wanted to contribute to the healing space she had created. Amy Chen Morrison, now 31 and the mother of twin daughters, had taken over much of the day-to-day management of the Domestic Violence Resource Center, allowing Lily to focus on her bakery while still maintaining her advocacy work. The partnership between the two women represented a kind of full-circle healing.
Amy helping other survivors, while Lily continued to provide the nourishment and comfort that had always been her way of caring for her community. Mom used to say that food was love made visible, Amy told a group of volunteers during a training session at the Resource Center. Watching Lily over the years, seeing how she used her bakery to create a safe space for people who needed healing, I understood that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply be kind to people who have been taught that they don't deserve kindness. The insight was representative of how Lily's story had influenced an entire generation of people who had grown up watching her transform trauma into service, survival into strength. Children who had eaten her cookies at school events had grown into adults who understood something fundamental about resilience and the possibility of redemption. On this September morning in 2029, as Lily watched the young woman from Iowa slowly sip her coffee while reading one of the trauma recovery books from the Survivor's Corner, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrified young woman who had killed her abuser at a parking lot 18 years earlier would never have imagined that her story would end with this: a life of service and connection, a business that fed both bodies and souls, a community that had learned to see strength in vulnerability. The bell above the bakery door chimed as David Richardson arrived for their standing coffee date, his smile brightening as he saw Lily arranging fresh flowers in the vase that Eleanor had given her for her 50th birthday. At 53, David carried his own history of working with trauma survivors, his own understanding of how long healing could take and how precious it was when it finally arrived. "How's the morning treating you?" he asked, accepting the coffee that Lily had prepared without being asked, the kind of small intimacy that spoke to years of careful relationship building. "It's a good morning," Lily replied, and meant it in ways that her younger self would never have believed possible. A very good morning.
Outside the windows of Murphy's Bakery, the town of Millbrook continued its daily rhythm of small-town life, forever changed by the events that had unfolded within its borders, but stronger for having grappled with difficult truths about survival, justice, and the possibility of redemption. The story that had begun with an arrest that shocked a community had evolved into something far more complex and hopeful. A testament to the possibility that even the worst experiences can become the foundation for something beautiful, that trauma can be transformed into wisdom, and that sometimes the most powerful form of justice is simply the chance to live a life defined by love rather than fear. As the morning progressed and the bakery filled with the familiar faces of customers who had become friends, family, and chosen community, Lily felt the deep satisfaction that comes from having found your purpose in the world. She had survived the worst that life could offer, had faced judgment and emerged vindicated, had transformed her pain into a gift for others who were still struggling to find their way. The bread dough that had been abandoned on that March morning 18 years earlier had finally risen, shaped by time and intention into something nourishing and beautiful. In the end, that might be the most profound form of justice, not the punishment of the guilty, but the transformation of the innocent into something that makes the world a little bit better, one act of kindness at a time. 10 years later, as Lily Nelson celebrated her 60th birthday, surrounded by a community that had grown to understand the difference between guilt and survival, between justice and revenge, between the person someone was forced to become and the person they chose to be, the simple truth remained. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to let the worst moments of your life define the rest of your story. The final chapter was still being written in acts of kindness, small and large, in survivors who found courage, in communities that chose understanding over judgment, and in the daily miracle of a woman who had learned to transform pain into purpose, one perfectly baked loaf of bread at a time. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel.